She thought he was just another passenger. Someone she could brush off, ignore, make wait while others were served. After all, she had done it before, small, silent decisions that shaped who belonged and who didn't. But this time, she made a mistake that would cost her more than she ever imagined. Because the man in seat 3A wasn't just another traveler. His family owned the airline. And now, as the plane sped through the sky, unaware passengers sipping their champagne, she had no idea that her quiet act of dismissal had set off a chain reaction she could no longer control. By the time the wheels touched the ground, the truth would come crashing down on her like a storm she never saw coming. Would she escape the consequences? Or was it already too late? Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where in the world are you watching from? And if you love gripping stories of justice, karma, and unexpected twists, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Now, buckle up, because on this flight, power is about to shift, and nothing will ever be the same. The hum of the aircraft was steady, a low, rhythmic vibration that filled the first-class cabin like a distant heartbeat. Outside the window, the tarmac shimmered under the midday sun, waves of heat rising in slow, hypnotic spirals. Passengers settled into their plush leather seats, adjusting silk scarves and tapping at sleek devices, wrapped in the quiet assurance of luxury. Dorian Hale sat in 3A, a window seat he had not requested but accepted without comment. He traveled often, enough that first class had become a place of observation rather than indulgence. A man accustomed to moving through spaces where his presence was often an unspoken question. Dorian had learned long ago that silence could be a shield as much as it was a weapon. He fastened his seatbelt, his fingers moving with the quiet precision of habit, and turned his gaze toward the aisle. The flight attendant, Julia Vaugh, moved through the cabin with a practiced grace, her smile reserved for those she deemed worthy of it. She was efficient, experienced, the kind of person who understood the subtleties of service, the small inflections in tone. The way a glass of champagne was offered with just enough deference to acknowledge status without servitude. She had worked these aisles long enough to recognize the patterns, the expectations, and, consciously or not, she had made a decision before the flight had even taken off. When Julia approached his row, she didn't look at him. Not directly. Her eyes skimmed past him like water rolling off stone, stopping instead on the woman seated across from him, Margot Ellison, a well-dressed widow in her 60s who exuded the quiet authority of old money. Julia leaned toward her with an easy, practiced warmth. "Would you care for a drink before takeoff, Ms. Ellison?" Margot smiled, nodding graciously. "A glass of sparkling water, please." Julia poured the drink with care, placing it gently on the tray table, the delicate clink of glass against metal almost ceremonial. Then, without missing a beat, she turned away, moving down the aisle as though the seat beside Margot were empty. Dorian let the moment settle, tasting its weight in the air. He was not surprised. He had seen this before on planes, in restaurants, in boardrooms where his presence had been met with the same polite omission. The refusal to see, the quiet decision that some people were passengers, and others were merely in transit. A few moments passed before he spoke, his voice even, deliberate. "Could I have a glass of water, please?" Julia hesitated, just for a second. A flicker of irritation crossed her face, so quick it might have been imagined, before she straightened and responded. Her tone clipped. "We'll be serving drinks later." Dorian glanced at the tray in her hands, where untouched glasses of water sat waiting. His fingers tapped lightly against the armrest, a gesture almost imperceptible, like the slow counting of seconds. "You're serving them now." She exhaled sharply, the kind of sigh people use when they want you to know you are an inconvenience. "I'll come back." And then she moved on, her uniform crisp, her posture unbothered, as though the request had never been made. Margot shifted in her seat, her fingers tightening around the stem of her glass. She glanced at Dorian, then quickly away, as though afraid that meeting his eyes might make her complicit in something uncomfortable. Across the aisle, another flight attendant, Hannah Porter, observed the exchange with a furrowed brow but said nothing. Dorian had long understood that silence was the most obedient accomplice of injustice. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and typed a brief message. Just a few words, nothing dramatic, nothing confrontational. Then he hit send. placed the phone down, and folded his hands neatly in his lap. From the outside, he appeared unbothered, his expression smooth, unreadable, but inside, something shifted. He wasn't looking for trouble. He never was, but there were moments, subtle, sharp-edged moments when a decision had to be made. And on this flight, a glass of water was about to change everything. The plane hummed with the quiet murmur of travelers settling into routine. Leather seats creaked beneath shifting bodies. Ice clinked in delicate glasses. The occasional rustle of a newspaper turning added a rhythmic counterpoint to the soft mechanical purr of the cabin. Outside the window, the world stretched vast and indifferent. White clouds rolling like waves across an endless ocean of sky. Dorian Hale sat motionless, his fingers resting lightly against the armrest, his gaze fixed straight ahead. But his mind turned inward. He was not a man given to unnecessary movements, nor one to demand attention. But he had spent a lifetime measuring the shape of moments like these. The quiet decision to overlook, the subtle withholding, the absence of something so small, so fundamental, that most people would not have noticed it was missing. A glass of water. Not a privilege, not a favor, simply a request, one met not with denial but with delay. A pause meant to establish unspoken rules. Some passengers are served, and others are made to wait. Across the aisle, Margot Ellison shifted in her seat, the golden band of her wedding ring catching the overhead light. She had lived long enough to recognize discomfort, to know when the air between two people carried something unspoken but heavy. She had once believed time softened such moments, that history would round the sharp edges of injustice until they no longer cut so deep. But now, as she watched the flight attendant move fluidly through the cabin, serving every outstretched hand except the one belonging to the man beside her, she felt the uneasy press of history sitting between them. Dorian did not press the matter. He did not call after the flight attendant, did not raise his voice or demand attention. He simply waited, and waiting, she realized, could be its own kind of protest. A few rows back, Hannah Porter had also seen it. She had not meant to watch, she had only been restocking the galley, adjusting the crisp folds of napkins, ensuring the polished service expected in first class remained seamless. But her eyes had caught the moment nonetheless. And now the thought of it stayed with her, an itch beneath her skin. It was easy to say nothing. Easier still to believe that nothing had happened. After all, what was a glass of water? What harm had been done? And yet, Hannah had spent years in this job, watching the intricate dance of airline etiquette, the way respect was portioned out like champagne in crystal flutes, freely for some, sparingly for others. She had seen the way passengers in tailored suits were met with warm familiarity, while those who did not fit the mold of expected wealth were greeted with polite efficiency. No more, no less. She had seen the lines drawn, the silent separations made not by walls but by deference, by ease, by the subtle language of who belonged and who did not. Julia Vaugh had drawn one such line today, whether she realized it or not. The intercom crackled overhead. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are cruising at 35,000 feet. We'll be starting our in-flight service shortly. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight." Dorian exhaled slowly, the deep, measured breath of a man who had been here before. This was not new. This moment, this pause, this choice to wait, it was an old story with endless retellings. Written into boardrooms, restaurants, sidewalks, classrooms, bank counters, 100,000 small moments that whispered the same thing: not yet. Not for you. Wait your turn. He had played this game before. He had learned long ago that indignation was a luxury not always afforded to men like him. That the world was quick to turn discomfort into accusation. And so he had mastered the art of patience, had turned silence into his shield, had learned that sometimes the most powerful thing a man could do was sit still and let the weight of the moment settle into the bones of those who chose to ignore it. Julia continued moving up and down the aisle, smiling, pouring, engaging in effortless conversation with the familiar ease of someone who understood the unspoken contract of first-class service. She did not look back toward seat 3A. She did not see how the older woman across from Dorian kept glancing at him, then away. She did not notice the tension resting in the younger flight attendant's shoulders, the way Hannah Porter's fingers hovered over a glass of water on the service cart. Hesitating, the choice was there, small but pivotal: to act, or to let things be. To speak, or to keep silent, to lean into the discomfort or turn away. Hannah took a breath, steadying herself, and then, without quite realizing she had decided, she reached for the glass. The weight of a moment is not always known while it is happening. Sometimes, history is written in the smallest acts of defiance. A glass of water, the first ripple in a storm. There are moments in life that pass unnoticed, forgotten before they even settle. And then there are moments that sit heavy in the air, pressing into the walls of a space, demanding to be acknowledged. The latter are rare, but once they arrive, they do not leave quietly. They linger in the pauses, in the hesitations, in the quick glances exchanged by those who understand without words. They change the course of things in ways both small and seismic. And on this flight, somewhere high above the ground, in the middle of an aisle lined with pressed suits and polished watches, one such moment had arrived, wrapped in the simplest of requests, a glass of water. Hannah Porter felt it before she could name it, the weight of something wrong, something unfinished, the slight shift in the atmosphere. Like the air before a storm, she stood by the cart, her hands moving through the motions of service, pouring and placing, smiling and nodding, but her mind kept circling back to seat 3A. It would be easy to do nothing, easy to assume it was an oversight, a misunderstanding, a thing so small it was hardly worth the energy it would take to fix. But Hannah had learned something in her years on flights like this. Silence is never neutral. It is a choice, the same as action, and in the spaces where injustice breathes, silence is the oxygen that keeps it alive. Her fingers curled around the stem of a water glass. The ice inside clinked softly, a sound barely audible over the low hum of conversation. But to Hannah, it felt deafening. The question was not whether Dorian Hale needed water. The question was whether she would allow this moment to pass unchallenged. Whether she would let the shape of things remain as they were unchanged. Unbothered, comfortably tilted in favor of those who had never had to ask twice. She lifted the glass. A few steps. That was all it would take. Just a few steps down the aisle. A quiet placement of the glass on the tray table. A simple acknowledgement of something that should have been given freely the first time it was asked for. And yet, those few steps felt impossibly long. As if each one carried the weight of history, of habit, of an unspoken rule that had been obeyed for too long. She turned, just as Julia Vaugh came back up the aisle. The flight attendant's uniform was pristine. Every button in place, her hair tucked neatly behind one ear. Her smile was still present, though thinner now, stretched across a face that had grown tighter with the slow realization that something had been noticed. Something had shifted. She saw the glass in Hannah's hand. She saw the direction of her step. And for the first time on this flight, her carefully measured expression faltered. "I told him I would get to it," Julia said, her voice low but firm, her tone carrying the quiet authority of someone who believed their position should not be questioned. Hannah stopped. The cabin around them carried on as if nothing were happening. Pages of newspapers turned. Passengers murmured. The engines thrummed beneath their feet. But here, in this narrow space between the rows, a choice was being made. "Then why haven't you?" Hannah asked, her voice just as low, just as firm. A flicker of something passed through Julia's eyes. Annoyance, perhaps, or something deeper, something resembling fear, though it was quickly masked by the smooth confidence of someone who had never been made to account for the small, steady ways they redrew the lines of belonging. "This is first class," Julia said, her voice clipped, as if that alone was an answer. Hannah exhaled, slow and steady. There it was, the quiet part spoken aloud, the thing that had been lingering beneath the surface, pressed between the layers of polite professionalism and well-practiced service. The reason Dorian Hale had been overlooked. The reason this glass of water was not just a glass of water. She could feel Julia's eyes on her, waiting for her to step back, to let it go, to let things remain as they had always been. Instead, Hannah moved. She stepped around Julia, her grip firm on the glass, and walked the short distance to seat 3A. She did not hesitate, did not waver. She simply placed the glass down with a quiet finality, as if laying down a stone in a river, altering its course in a way that could not be undone. Dorian Hale looked at the glass, then at her. He did not smile, did not nod in gratitude. He did not need to. Instead, he simply reached forward, wrapped his fingers around the cool surface, and lifted it to his lips, taking a slow sip before setting it back down. It was a simple thing, A basic thing. And yet, in the space between them, Hannah felt something shift. Julia's breath was sharp behind her. You just made this a bigger deal than it needed to be. She hissed under her breath. Hannah turned. Her pulse was steady. Her decision made. No, she said simply, her voice unwavering. You did. And with that, she walked away, leaving Julia standing there, her carefully composed mask beginning to crack. A glass of water had been served, but something far greater had been set into motion. The moment the glass of water touched the tray table, the world did not shift. The engines did not shudder. The lights did not flicker. The flight did not suddenly veer off course. And yet, something had changed. Something had cracked. The way ice does under steady pressure. The way silence gives way to the first words of a truth too long ignored. Dorian Hale took his time. He lifted the glass with deliberate ease, the condensation cool against his fingertips, and took a sip, slow and unbothered. He set it down again with the kind of finality reserved for those who do not rush to claim what should have already been given. The world, it seemed, had finally caught up with what he already knew. There are battles won not in shouts, but in silence, not in force, but in the refusal to yield. Julia Voss stood frozen in the aisle, her hands clenching at her service cart as if steadying herself against the weight of something invisible. Her eyes flickered first toward Dorian, then toward Hannah, then toward the murmuring passengers who had begun to sense that something beyond the usual rituals of air travel was unfolding before them. Margot Ellison adjusted her silk scarf with an unnecessary precision, her fingers tightening around the fabric. Across the aisle, a businessman lowered his newspaper, his eyes peering over the edge like a man who had just realized he was witnessing history and was unsure whether to lean in or look away. Julia turned sharply, her steps quick and clipped as she disappeared toward the front of the plane. The air in the cabin seemed to thicken in her absence, charged with an energy both unfamiliar and inevitable. Dorian said nothing. He did not need to. But Hannah Porter, standing a few feet away, watching Julius retreat, felt the shift like a change in altitude, sudden, disorienting, irreversible. She had not set out to make a statement. She had not intended to create a spectacle. But that is the nature of truth. It does not ask permission before making itself known. And in that moment, as she stood in the quiet hum of first class, she realized something she had always known but never truly acknowledged. There is no such thing as neutrality. You either uphold the world as it is, or you push to make it better. Up ahead, Julia entered the cockpit, her breath tight in her chest. The door shut behind her with a finality that made her stomach twist. Captain Reed Lancaster sat in his chair, his gaze fixed on the sky beyond the windshield, his hands steady on the controls. He did not look up when she entered, but Elliot Grayson, the in-flight operations supervisor, did. Something wrong, Miss Vaugh? Elliot's voice was quiet, even, the kind that made people nervous not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. Julia straightened her uniform, her fingers brushing over the fabric as if smoothing away the evidence of her unease. There was an issue with a passenger, she said, keeping her voice measured. A misunderstanding. Elliot did not blink. A misunderstanding, he repeated. She nodded, not trusting herself to say more. The silence stretched between them, long enough for the sound of the engines to fill the space. Captain Lancaster finally turned his head, his face unreadable. You checked the flight manifest before assuming he didn't belong in first class? Elliot asked, his voice still even, still quiet, but carrying an unmistakable weight. Julia felt her throat tighten. A beat of hesitation, a half-second too long. Did you? She swallowed hard. I didn't assume anything. Elliot exhaled, the sound short, clipped, as if dismissing an excuse before it could fully form. He tapped the manifest in his hands, his eyes locking onto hers. Father Dorian Hale, he said, his voice flat. Passenger in seat 3A. You know who he is, don't you? Julia felt the floor beneath her shift. Even though the plane itself remained steady, she didn't need to answer. She knew now, even if she hadn't known then. And worse than knowing was the realization that it did not matter. Not because of his name, not because of his status, but because none of it should have been necessary in the first place. Captain Lancaster turned back toward the windshield. Fix it, he said simply. Elliot did not speak, but his silence was its own command. Julia felt the heat creep up her neck as she turned and walked out of the cockpit. The door shut behind her. And with it, whatever illusion of control she had left. The walk back down the aisle felt longer than before. The seats felt closer. The air thicker. She could feel eyes on her now. Subtle but undeniable. The weight of quiet judgment pressing against her skin. And then, she was there, standing before seat 3A. Standing before Dorian Hale. He looked up at her. His face calm, unreadable. The kind of expression that had been mastered over years of knowing that some battles are fought not with words, but with patience. Julia's throat was dry. She forced a small, stiff smile, one that felt unnatural even to her. "Father Hale," she said, her voice thinner than she intended. "I wanted to personally apologize for the misunderstanding earlier." Dorian studied her, silent. Julia felt the weight of it. She had done apologies before. Smoothed over mistakes. Eased tensions with carefully measured words. But this time, the words felt empty before they even left her lips. "It wasn't my intention to make you feel unwelcome in first class," she added, the phrase tasting unnatural, artificial. "I should have served you right away." Dorian tilted his head slightly, considering her, and then, for the first time, he spoke. "You're saying it was a misunderstanding," he said, his voice quiet, controlled. "What exactly did you misunderstand?" Julia felt her breath catch. Around them, the murmurs in the cabin stilled. She opened her mouth, but for the first time in her career, she had no answer. Dorian did not press. He did not need to. The silence stretched, heavy and deliberate, and then, slowly, he reached for the glass of water in front of him, lifting it with steady fingers. He took a sip, just as he had before, slow and unhurried. When he set it down again, he met her gaze once more. "Yes," he said simply, his voice firm. "You did." And with that, the conversation was over. Julia stood there for a moment longer, her hands tightening into fists at her sides, the heat of embarrassment crawling up her skin. Then, with a stiff nod, she turned and walked away, each step feeling heavier than the last. As she disappeared into the galley, the tension in the cabin did not fade. Margot Ellison exhaled softly, turning her gaze back to her glass, her fingers tracing the rim absently. Across the aisle, a businessman shifted in his seat, his face carefully neutral, and in the back, Hannah Porter stood by the service cart, watching, her chest rising and falling with a breath she had not realized she was holding. And Dorian Hale? He simply sat back in his seat, resting his hands in his lap, and waited for the flight to land. For him, the lesson had never been his to learn. The plane cut through the sky like a silver thread unraveling across the fabric of the clouds. Steady and uninterrupted, but inside the cabin, something had shifted. It was not loud, not the kind of change that rattles trays or sparks whispered conversations. But it was there, in the stillness that settled over first class like a layer of dust shaken loose. Julia Vaugh had disappeared behind the curtain, her presence reduced to a lingering energy. A stain of discomfort she could not wipe away. And yet, even in her absence, the moment she had created continued to breathe, stretching itself into the spaces between passengers, curling around half-finished drinks, slipping into the quiet beats of eye contact quickly averted. Margot Ellison sat with her hands folded over her lap, her wedding ring cool against her fingers, her mind tracing the fine line between guilt and relief. She had said nothing, she had done nothing, and yet, she had felt everything, the sting of the moment, the shape of its weight. She had seen it before. In small ways. In ways that had made her purse her lips and turn her gaze toward a window. A book, a distraction, but something about this was different. Perhaps it was the way Dorian Hale had met the moment, not with outrage. Not with demands, but with a patience so precise it had cut through the air like the sharp edge of a blade. She wondered, briefly, how many times he had sat just like this. His hands resting on his lap, his dignity intact, while the world around him debated whether or not to see him. A few rows back, a businessman who had once been fully absorbed in his tablet now found himself scrolling without reading. He had heard the exchange, had felt the tremor of something beneath the words, something deeper than a service delay, something he could not quite name but understood instinctively. He had built a life on reading people, negotiating deals, knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. And yet, here, in the pressurized quiet of first class, He found himself wondering about the weight of a silence that was not his own. Hannah Porter exhaled as she folded a napkin with a precision she did not usually care for. Her hands were steady, but her mind was restless, rewinding the moment over and over. She had acted. That should have been enough. And yet, as she stood in the galley, the hum of the engines filling the empty space where words should have been, she realized how much further there was to go. It was not enough to act once. Not enough to step in when the world tilted slightly off course. The real work was in holding the line when no one was looking. In refusing to let the moment pass unnoticed, unmarked. Julia sat on the small fold-out jump seat, her hands gripping the edge of her tray, her heart still pounding in a rhythm she could not slow. She had been wrong. She knew it now. Knew it in the way Elliot had looked at her. In the way Captain Lancaster had dismissed her with a single command. In the way the air had thickened around her as she had walked back down the aisle. Knowing that no one was looking at her. And yet, somehow, everyone was. There was no undoing it. No softening it. It sat heavy in her chest. An unfamiliar weight pressing against the careful composure she had spent years perfecting. And in seat 3A, Dorian Hale remained as he had always been, still. Composed. Unshaken. He did not glance at his watch. Did not reach for his phone. Did not attempt to close the book that had sat unopened on his tray table for the last hour. He did not need to. He had already learned what so many still struggled to understand. Some lessons are not for the ones who have endured them. They are for the ones who have only just begun to see. The plane did not falter. Did not deviate from its course. But the people inside of it, some of them, at least, had already begun to shift. And when they landed, when the seatbelt sign flicked off and passengers reached for their belongings, when first class emptied out and the world resumed as though nothing had happened, some of them would carry the weight of this moment with them. Some of them would forget. But others, perhaps, would remember. And in that remembering, change had already begun. The descent began with a soft chime. A subtle shift in altitude. The kind of transition so smooth it was almost imperceptible. The captain's voice crackled through the intercom. His words calm, practiced, reassuring. Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our final approach. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened. Tray tables are stowed. And all carry-on items are secured. Flight attendants, prepare for landing. The instruction was simple, but beneath it, layered between the routine and the expected, was something heavier, something not everyone could name, but some could feel. The world below was coming into focus. But for those still lingering in the weight of what had transpired in the air, the descent was not just physical. Julia Vaugh sat rigid in her jump seat, her hands clasped too tightly together, her uniform crisp but suffocating. She had spent years moving through the aisles of planes like a dancer on a well-rehearsed stage. Never missing a beat, always controlling the rhythm of service, the flow of attention. But today, the script had been rewritten in real time. And she had been caught in its unraveling. She had been wrong before. She could admit that. A forgotten drink order here. A slight misstep there. But this was different. This was not a mistake of memory or timing. This was a mistake of perception. Of judgment. Of a reflex so ingrained she had not questioned it until it was too late. She had drawn a line without realizing she had drawn it. And then, when confronted with it, she had tried to justify its existence rather than erase it. Now, there was no erasing, only reckoning. Hannah Porter stood a few rows back, her hands moving over the service cart, mechanically securing loose items. But her mind was elsewhere. She had spoken up. Yes, she had placed the glass of water down. Had looked Julia in the eye. Had refused to let silence settle over the moment like dust on an untended shelf. But was that enough? It was easy to step in when the injustice was clear. When the lines had already been drawn. But what about when they weren't? What about the moments that weren't as loud? That weren't as obvious? The ones that happened in spaces where no one was watching? This, she thought, this is what separates those who mean well from those who change things. It is not just about doing the right thing once. It is about committing to it again and again, in spaces big and small, until it is no longer a decision but a way of being. Dorian Hale remained composed, his seatbelt fastened, his gaze resting on the window as the city below grew sharper, more defined. He had not asked for an apology, and yet it had come. He had not demanded accountability, and yet it had arrived. Stumbling, reluctant, but arriving nonetheless. This was not his first flight. Not his first time being made to wait for what was freely given to others. But this was the first time he had seen the lesson unfold in real time. The first time he had witnessed the slow, painful realization settle into the face of the one who had drawn the line. He had learned long ago that change is not something you force into people. It is something they must come to on their own. Some never do, but some, given the right moment, the right weight of silence, begin to see. Margot Ellison pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the slight flutter of her own heartbeat as she watched Julia out of the corner of her eye. She had been alive long enough to recognize shame when she saw it. To know that there were two paths from here, one that would lead Julia toward change, and one that would lead her toward resentment. She had seen both in her lifetime, had watched people either lean into discomfort or recoil from it. But in the end, it was always the same question. Will you face yourself? Or will you flee from what you now know? The wheels touched the ground with a soft but certain impact. A moment of stillness before the rush forward. The roar of engines slowing. The hum of the cabin shifting as the weight of gravity reclaimed the plane. People exhaled. Some stretched. Some reached for their phones. The mundanity of travel resumed. But not for all. For some, this landing was not just about reaching a destination. It was about stepping off this plane with a different weight in their bones. Julia swallowed hard as she stood, her hands smoothing the fabric of her uniform as if it could straighten out more than just wrinkles. She walked back into the aisle, her movements less assured than before. When she reached seat 3A, she hesitated just long enough for Dorian to look up. She started, but the words caught. She took a breath, steadied herself, and tried again. I want you to know I understand now. Dorian studied her, not unkindly, but with the quiet patience of someone who had heard too many words too late before. He nodded once, his expression unreadable. I hope so. She felt the weight of that. Not condemnation, not dismissal, but expectation. Hannah, watching from a distance, saw the moment for what it was, a beginning. Fragile but real. She let out a slow breath. Not in satisfaction, but in understanding. There was no grand resolution here. No cinematic ending where all was neatly tied up. There was only this. A glass of water that had been denied. And then given. A mistake that had been made. And then acknowledged. A landing that had been just another flight for some. But a turning point for others. The seatbelt signs dimmed. The aisle filled. The world moved forward. And yet, for those who had truly been watching, this flight would not be forgotten. Because the truth is this. Change does not come in grand gestures or sweeping declarations. It comes in small moments. In choices. In the willingness to face discomfort. And when the moment arrives, when the weight of a choice is pressed into your hands, the question will always be the same: will you carry it forward? Or will you let it go? The answer, as always, is up to you. The cabin doors opened with a mechanical hiss. And just like that, the moment was over. Or at least, that was the illusion. The passengers stood, stretching stiff limbs, reaching for their bags, eager to step back into the world where the air smelled like pavement and gasoline instead of pressurized oxygen. Conversations resumed, small talk hummed, and the ritual of departure began. But not all weight is shed so easily. Some things, once seen, once felt, do not stay in the air, they follow you. Cling to the edges of your consciousness like a stain you cannot wash out. Julia Vaugh stood near the front of the plane, hands folded tightly, her breath steady but shallow. She had spent years perfecting the art of the exit, the polished goodbye. The easy smile, the kind of graciousness that made passengers feel as if their experience had been curated just for them. But today, she felt like a stranger in her own uniform, as if the name tag pinned to her chest bore someone else's identity. She had spent the last hour replaying the exchange, over and over, the way his eyes had held her in place, the way his silence had been heavier than any reprimand she had ever received. She had apologized. Yes, she had forced the words out, shaped them into something that resembled accountability. But she knew the truth. An apology is not an eraser. It does not undo. It does not absolve. It only marks the beginning of a debt that must now be paid in action. Dorian Hale took his time. He was in no rush to stand, no hurry to reclaim his place among the moving bodies eager to escape this confined space. He knew, as he always knew, that the real test was never in the moment itself, but in what came after. People would watch. They would witness. And then they would make a choice: to remember or to forget. To carry the weight or to set it down at the first opportunity. And he had lived long enough to know that most chose the latter. Margot Ellison hesitated before stepping into the aisle. She could hear the murmur of other passengers behind her, the impatience creeping into their voices. But she did not move just yet. She had spent a lifetime in rooms where people prided themselves on politeness, on the art of conversation, on knowing exactly what to say and when to say it. And yet, she had no words for what she had just witnessed. It was not dramatic, not loud, not the kind of moment that made headlines. But it had unsettled her in a way she could not shake. She had watched a man ask for water. And she had watched the world hesitate to give it to him. And she had sat there, her silence as crisp and deliberate as the napkin folded on her lap. Hannah Porter lingered near the galley, her hands gripping the handle of the beverage cart. She had thought that speaking up, that placing the glass of water down, would be enough, that it would settle the unease in her chest, let her walk away knowing she had done something. But the truth of it was gnawing at her now. Doing something once does not make you someone who does the right thing. It is a muscle that must be exercised, a habit that must be built. One act does not define you. The ones that follow do. Passengers began to move down the aisle, stepping over the residue of discomfort as if it did not exist. The business traveler straightened his tie, scrolling through emails that had been waiting for him in the real world. A young woman snapped open her compact mirror, adjusting her lipstick, pushing away whatever traces of the last few hours still clung to her. People exited the way they had entered, wrapped in their own lives, their own narratives, their own priorities. Julia forced herself to look up when Dorian Hale stepped forward. She expected him to walk past her, to claim his bag and move on, to do what so many others had done, to let the moment dissipate like vapor. But he stopped, just for a second, just long enough to meet her eyes. And what she saw there was not anger, not resentment, but something worse: expectation. It would be easy, she knew, to convince herself that this was the end of it, that a lesson had been learned, that the next flight would be different, that the next passenger would receive the kind of service she had denied him. But easy was the reason this had happened in the first place. Easy was why she had walked past him in the aisle, why she had sighed when he asked for something as basic as water. Easy was the refuge of those who wanted to be good without having to change. Dorian said nothing as he stepped past her, and that silence was louder than any farewell. Margot adjusted her purse strap as she reached the jet bridge, her heels clicking against the metal floor, her thoughts restless. It was strange, the way certain things refused to fade. She had seen men humiliated before, had watched injustice unfold in 1,000 subtle ways, had told herself, time and again, that it was not her place. But time had a way of catching up with you, of pressing into the spaces where you had let yourself look away. She made a decision before she could second-guess it. Julia, still standing near the cabin door, startled slightly when she felt the touch on her elbow. She turned to see Margot looking at her, eyes sharp, expression unreadable. And then, in a voice quiet but firm, the older woman said something that would follow Julia long after the flight had landed. "You should have just given him the water." And then she was gone. The airport stretched wide ahead of them, fluorescent lights reflecting against tiled floors, the steady hum of movement filling the space. Outside, the world continued as it always had: cars lined up at curbs, families reunited, strangers brushing past one another with no knowledge of the moments that had unfolded just 35,000 feet above their heads. But some would carry the weight of that flight with them, the way a stone sits at the bottom of a riverbed, unseen but permanent. Dorian walked with steady steps, his pace unhurried. He had no bags to retrieve, no need to rush. He had seen this story play out too many times to believe in instant resolutions. Change, real change, did not happen in the span of a single flight. It happened in the spaces in between, in the quiet decisions people made when no one was watching. And so, he did not turn back. He simply stepped forward, into the terminal, into the next moment, into whatever came next. The airport terminal hummed with movement, a river of people flowing toward destinations known and unknown. Suitcases rolled across polished floors. Voices called out in greeting or farewell. And flight announcements droned overhead, barely acknowledged. Life continued as it always did, steady, relentless, indifferent. But for some, for those attuned to the weight of moments, There was something different in the air. Something that did not vanish just because the plane had landed. Some stories do not end at the gate. Some lessons do not expire with arrival. Some truths, once seen, do not allow themselves to be forgotten. Dorian Hale walked through the terminal with measured steps. His posture straight, his face composed. He had spent a lifetime mastering this. The art of carrying himself as though nothing could shake him. As though every room he entered had always been expecting him. He knew the world did not work that way. He knew the subtle lines that had been drawn long before he arrived. The expectations stitched into the fabric of places that did not believe he belonged. But he also knew this. Dignity is not something anyone grants you. It is something you claim. And so, he moved forward, unburdened by the weight others had tried to place on him, leaving behind only the quiet certainty that he had not bent beneath it. Julia Vaugh was not as steady. She stood at the gate, her hands clenched into fists so tight her nails pressed into her palms. Her pulse still unsteady from the conversation she had not been prepared for. "You should have just given him the water." The words sat in her chest like a stone dropped into a deep well. The kind of truth that does not echo, it simply sinks, settling where it will not be moved. She had thought the moment would pass, that the discomfort would fade as easily as turbulence giving way to smooth skies. But there are some things you cannot smooth over. Not with protocol, not with a carefully managed apology, not with the hope that people will forget. She had stepped into that cabin as someone certain of her place in the world. She was stepping out of it as someone who had seen, for the first time, the cracks in the ground she had been walking on. Margot Ellison took her time gathering her things, as if delaying the moment when she would have to step back into the rhythm of her carefully curated life. She had spent decades believing that wisdom came with age. That experience made a person better at navigating the quiet injustices of the world. And yet, here she was, realizing how easy it had been to watch and do nothing. She had spent her life among people who had taught her the art of polite silence, the power of looking away. But the truth was this: looking away does not erase what has happened. It only makes you complicit in the comfort of those who benefit from the silence. The next time, she told herself, she would not be so still. Hannah Porter wiped down the galley counter with slow, deliberate strokes, her mind restless in a way she could not fully name. She had thought that speaking up, that placing the glass of water on the tray table, had been enough. But enough for what? A single act does not make a person just. A single intervention does not erase the countless times she had chosen convenience over courage. The world did not change because one person did the right thing once. It changed when doing the right thing became a habit, a reflex, a way of moving through the world that required no hesitation. She would remember this moment not because it had been a breaking point, but because it had been a beginning. The question now was whether she would let it end here. Outside the airport doors, the city pulsed with its usual rhythm. The streets stretched out in long veins of movement. Taxis weaving between cars. Pedestrians stepping into crosswalks with hurried intent. The world did not pause for revelations. It did not slow down for realizations. It did not ask whether a lesson had been learned before pulling people into the next moment, the next decision, the next chance to do something different. Dorian did not look back as he stepped into the sun, the warmth settling on his skin, steadying him in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. He did not need to see who was still standing at the gate, still grappling with what had unfolded. That was their work to do now. He had already done his. He had already learned the lesson long ago. It is not his job to make people see. It is their job to open their own eyes. And so, he walked forward, not waiting for the world to catch up. Because the truth is this: change is not a moment. It is not a single flight, or a single conversation, or a single lesson learned too late. Change is what happens after. It is in the choices people make when no one is watching. It is in the weight they choose to carry, in the discomfort they refuse to set down, in the ways they refuse to let the world lull them back into forgetting. And when the next moment comes, and it always comes, the question is never will the opportunity be there? It is will you be ready to take it? That is the real test. Not what you see, but what you do after.